Our first gun position was in an apple orchard. That's what all the guys remembered, that apple orchard, our first gun position. Well, the outfit that I was with, they kept talking to me about, you guys in the forward observation crew are going to be the first one killed. And we heard it constantly. The guys on the guns thought that they were going to be safe, but it so happened they suffered the first casualties. But they kept saying, you're going to get killed before anybody else. I kept saying, never happen. You'll be the first ones killed. Never happen. I heard that so much that I painted that on my Jeep. Never happen, right under the windshield. And people would wonder, what do you mean, never happened? They'd ask that. Other people would see the name on there. So I tell them what they were telling me and what my answer was. In fact, if an officer wanted to take one of the Jeeps, he'd have to have a driver drive him. And if nobody was available, they might say, take never happen. So everyone knew what Jeep that was that they were to take. One thing I didn't like about that, these guys wouldn't fill it with gas when they got back. And I finally complained. I said to the officer, I said, I have to keep this gas tank filled all the time in case we have to use it. And he said, yeah, that's right. And so they had an order then, if anyone uses never happen, make sure you fill that gas tank when you get back. That's the thing I didn't like about that. Our first day in combat was one of the worst days of my life. We got the orders to go so many miles forward to an approximate location. We had maps, and establish an observation point high enough to see the German lines and where they might be firing guns from, or where there might be see the German men walking around. So we were looking for a high point. We didn't have any other suggestions other than find a high point where you can observe the enemy. So here I was driving down this street of this small town. We noticed the infantry Jeeps. They had the windshields all folded flat. They had covers on their windshields, and they were driving like the wind. Here we were meandering down the road in our Jeep the other direction, looking around, trying to see a high point. Finally, a soldier stepped out from a doorway, and he said, I stopped. He said, if I were you, I wouldn't go any farther. He said, there's Germans just down here, 5 houses. He said, I'm the last American. I wouldn't advise you going any further. So I made what I call an illegal U-turn. I tore back the other way, but we're still driving with our windshield up, and not driving like the wind as these infantry guys were doing. They didn't want to get hit with German fire. But Lieutenant Seabold saw this big pile of coal. He said, boy, that would be a good vantage point if we could get up there. It was. It was a bad idea. We just got filthy walking up that pile of coal. And we got up there and looked around. We could see a long ways. Well, we're right up there almost to the top. We began getting artillery fire from the Germans. What we hadn't thought about, we can see them, but they could see us too. We hadn't even thought of such a thing. Dumb. First day in combat, and there we are. Well, Lieutenant Seabold at one of the reunions that we had, he said, "I never saw two people dig a foxhole as quick as Bishop and Bradley." Actually, no, none of us took time to dig a foxhole. We were laying as flat as we could on that coal pile. And this is the truth now. I'm not enlarging on this at all. This German 88 shell came in and lit about 6 feet from me. I can still see that dust from the coal shooting out. But it didn't explode. And I've always thought perhaps I can give thanks to a Polish worker that had been forced to make ammunition for the German army. And he had made that shell so that it wouldn't explode. So my first day in combat, it was one of my worst days. We drove down to the bottom of the coal pile. I should say walked back down, almost ran. We decided the coal pile wasn't a good place to have an observation post. But then we saw this water tower, and that was out in front of the infantry. This water tower was out in front of the town, maybe 100 feet out in front of any buildings. And we got into the water tower and walked the circular steps up, and Siebold finally said, "I think this would be the best spot we could get for an observation post. We're up high, we can see for miles." So we decided to use that as an observation post. Well, the cold weather was beyond our belief. In that water tower, I never got my feet thawed out. My feet were numb all the time. The weather was so cold. We were, at night, we would be on the scope looking out towards the enemy. I'd be on for 2 hours, and then I'd be off for 2 hours, for 4 hours. On the scope for 2 hours, and off the scope for 4 hours. And so we do that trading off while the others tried to sleep. Well, when I got back and tried to crawl into the bedroll, I had to take off my overshoes, overcoat. I couldn't wear an overcoat in bed. I threw it over me, but my feet never did get warmed up. And how I escaped frostbite, I still don't know to this day. That was a miserable time. In the daytime, we could see good. In the nighttime, if the enemy was firing their guns, we could see that pretty good too. But on this, I think it was the third day we were there, the Germans finally figured out that they were being observed by us in that water tower, and they turned their guns down, their 88 millimeter guns, firing what we call direct fire, aiming the gun, getting the gun lined up, not with an aiming circle, but aiming at that tower. Here were these shells whistling by and exploding right behind us. And Siebold knew right away, they know we're here. Well, the Germans recognized that we were using that water tower as an observation post, and they turned their guns down to fire direct fire at us. They were maybe a mile to a mile and a half away. And these shells began zinging past and exploding behind us. And Siebold said, well, they know where we're at, let's get out of here. So what we were afraid of, a shell hitting that water tower and collapsing the concrete, and we'd all be in a pile of concrete. So we ran down as fast as we could with our equipment, like our scope and field glasses, bedrolls, K-rations, whatnot. And we got to the Jeep. I was hoping I didn't have a dead battery. And we were able to jump in that Jeep and got away from there. And so that was a terrible experience for me there. Well, that wasn't the worst experience. We had worse experiences than that. Going into the German towns, all we saw was older people. Not too many of them were left, but they would put their hands up and they say, "Nix Nazi, Nix Nazi." It wasn't just once or twice. Every new town that we went in, we heard the same thing. And I heard that so much, I thought, well, I'm going to paint that on my Jeep too. So I painted Nix Nazi up above Never Happened. After that, I didn't hear people saying Nix Nazi, but they're looking at that sign and laughing. I had no idea what they were laughing about. I got home after the war was over. I found out you don't spell Nix in German N-I-X like I had it on the Jeep. The correct spelling is N-I-C-H-T-S. But those Krauts would look at that and laugh, and I had no idea what they were laughing about. But that's what it was about. Well, I painted that on my Jeep, so I had both names on the Jeep. As the Germans retreated, a lot of the civilians would leave their homes, so we went right into them. And we'd, almost all the time we were in Germany, we'd just move into Germans' homes and live there for the 3 or 4 days or 2 weeks, whatever it was that we were there. But in this one home that we went to, one of the guys in our group, he went into the basement of that home and he found a lot of real nice dishes and tablecloths. So we decided to use them. So before supper time at night for our K rations, open a box, open a little tin can of some kind of meat of some kind. But we put on this nice array of dishes and cups, and then we would take turns cleaning the table up and taking the dishes away. So they'd say, "Whose turn is it tonight?" Whosever turn it was, he'd get the corners of that nice tablecloth, fold it around all the nice plates and dishes, and throw it out the window. That's how we cleaned up the table. A dirty trick. I can't imagine us doing that now, but that was the mentality that we had. These Germans deserved this. That was the mentality that we had. So that's how we cleaned up the dishes afterwards. And I think I'll go to that matter now of these German soldiers advancing across this open field, coming towards us. And I don't know which one of us detected first these German soldiers, but they were spread out maybe 10 feet apart. Have you ever seen Americans advancing on a target? How they're all spread out, they're not close together. That's so if an artillery shell hits, it doesn't hit a lot of people. So that's the way they were. They were spread out coming towards us. And so Siebold got permission to bring fire upon these Germans, and he was able to make the adjustment pretty quickly so that they could fire all 4 guns. And Lieutenant Siebold called for fuse air so it'd explode over their heads. And he was zeroed in pretty good. We could see the artillery shell exploding over the German soldiers falling to the ground. Siebold grabbed the phone to go back to the guns, and before that he said, "Look at those so-and-so's fall." And he grabbed the phone and says, "Repeat, fire for effect. So they got one more big round, 4 rounds more hit right over the heads of the Germans. How many were killed? I have no idea. It's gone from my memory completely how long we watched that area. I don't remember anything about that after that. So I don't know how many were killed in that. We were with the infantry quite a bit, and we got quite a bit of information from them. But one of the things that was formative to him, one of these infantrymen told me when I was talking with him, if you hear a zing as a bullet goes by, it's missed you by a safe margin. But he says if you hear it pop, it's awful close. Well, I was up at this place called Lindern. In fact, it was the area that I was written up to get the Bronze Star. It was from that same area. But I was going downstairs from the scope that we were on. I was going downstairs to go outside to use the bathroom. You know, we had luxury bathrooms in wartime. And this was kind of a nice home. It had been a nice home, and it had a courtyard. So any place we'd go, the first thing we did was dig a slit trench. You know what that was for? To use the bathroom. You squatted over a thing about this wide and relieved yourself. That was our luxury bathrooms. That was the first thing we do when we get into a position, is to dig a slit trench. Now we had another guy that mouthed off against an officer. And he didn't only have to dig a slit trench, he had to dig a hole 6 foot wide, 6 foot long, and 6 foot deep, just because he'd mouthed off at a lieutenant, maybe the captain. And boy, he got it. All that work for nothing, all because he mouthed off at an officer. I don't know if he learned his lesson or not, but it was kind of funny to see that hole out there. Nothing. That's what he had to do. But in that area where I heard the pop, I was walking down the hallway of this nice home. I'd gone down the stairs and walking down the hallway to go outside. And that's when I heard the pop. It went right past me. And I thought of that guy immediately, what this infantryman had told me. And I thought, well, that was pretty close that time. I heard a pop and not a zing. One area I didn't touch on a while ago is driving blackout at night. We couldn't drive with our lights on so we could see where we were going. But the lead vehicle had to know where they were going. We had one major move that took the most of the night. From the time we left one gun position to the next, these blackout lights could be seen for about 20 feet. And if you lost sight of that truck or vehicle ahead of you, you've lost him. We had to stay within sight of the truck or vehicle in front of us. So this was kind of a critical thing, not being able to really see the road, following the truck or the vehicle ahead of us and trying to keep the same distance, about 20 feet. We couldn't let that one out of our sight. So that's how we traveled driving blackout. Having your lights on would have been a payoff for the Germans. So that's why we had a lot of bad times. One of the worst times that we had was on what we called Four Corners. It was where two main streets crossed. That's where we had to go up because the other observation crews had been knocked out. and so they had to go back to the guns. And we walked into that area, and we went into the basement looking for a place to sleep. And then we were told that, well, the place was just torn up, that the Germans had used a fuse delay. That shell came through the building and exploded in that basement and killed everybody in it. So Lieutenant Siebold was looking around, and he said, well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going up in the attic and sleep. You know, one thing I did have an advantage, having the Jeep. I'd able to find these German blankets that they'd left in their homes when they left. And so I'd put these extra blankets in my Jeep, and I'd have more of a pad to sleep on instead of on a wood floor. So I did have an advantage there. And I remember packing those blankets up there to stretch out on the floor of the attic up there. But we had the big stuff coming in then. The Germans were firing their 150 millimeter guns at that corner. And that's where I did more praying than I did any time. I was afraid of dying. I knew the gospel from as far back as I can remember, knowing that salvation comes through faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. But I was still unsaved. And I prayed to God time after time. And I remember that corner more than any place else where we were being fired at. And my prayer was always the same: oh God, don't let me die yet. I'm not ready to die. But why didn't I trust the Lord right then? He asked someone the other day, does the Lord answer the prayer of an unsaved person? I've heard it said the only prayer that God hears from an unsaved person is, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But God is everywhere. Somehow He preserved me through the war for some narrow escapes. And that corner was one of them. In that very corner where we had our observation post for a few days. There's a guy right down here from Redlands. His name was Robert Brake. He was in headquarters battery of our battalion. And I forget if it was A battery or B battery. They had something happen. They were knocked out of action there, and they sent us back up there. But Robert Brake was up there not long before we got there. And their Jeep got stuck in the mud. And he was out by the front wheel of his Jeep. And one of these German 88 exploded right beside him. So naturally he was hit from head to foot. They evacuated him to behind the lines. He stayed there for a while. They got him to England. He was in England over a year. And brought back to the United States where he had more treatment. Well, I saw him for the first time. You see, I went through school with him, from kindergarten through high school. But I had never met him during the war, even though we were the same battalion. I never saw him. But he told me then exactly where he was, by that Jeep, by the right front wheel of the Jeep, and that German 88 shell went off. And so he doesn't remember hardly anything about that incident now. But he had kind of a sad story to tell me. He said, I just sold, I think he said, an acre of land. Maybe it was 5 acres. Anyway, he said, I have $1 million and I don't know what to do with it. Don't you feel sorry for him? That was Robert Brake. Well, anyway, he's the guy I went to school with. He was in the same battalion I was in. I never saw him. And he was in the group that was up there at the observation post for some reason. And he was knocked out of action there with that German 88. Well, we had a lot of bad stuff happening then. And then the matter of the Bronze Star. I was written up to get this because of action up there at Lindern, the same place where I heard that pop is when the shell went by him. But it's written up that I stayed at my post despite the fact of the shells that were hitting very close by and continuing to send back information. But I was in far worse places than that. But anyway, this is what I got the Bronze Star for. I'll repeat again for the camera. It was kind of a common saying amongst the soldiers, I'd rather be a live coward than a dead hero. Some people would do daring things, and they were awarded accordingly. But that's where the Bronze Star came from for me. In this town of Lindern, where the Bronze Star was awarded, we were out there all by ourselves, a long ways from everywhere. We had to make a 90-degree angle turn to get into this little town. So we only